Christmas Eve in Briar Hollow always arrived quietly. Snow fell the same way it had for decades, slow and soft, covering the town like a deliberate act of mercy. Houses glowed with warm yellow light, wreaths hung on doors that rarely stayed locked. In a town this small, locks were considered unnecessary, almost insulting. Everyone knew everyone, and more importantly, everyone trusted everyone. That was the lie Briar Hollow lived by. On the night of December 24th, the town gathered for its annual Christmas candlelight service. The church bells rang at 6, echoing through the narrow streets, calling families out of their homes and into the pews where generations had prayed side by side. Children whispered and fidgeted, elderly couples held hands. The choir sang familiar hymns, their voices blending into something comforting and predictable. Among them sat Daniel Mercer. Daniel was born in Briar Hollow, just like his father and his grandfather before him. He worked at the local hardware store, coached Little League in the summer, and fixed his neighbors' furnaces when winter got too harsh. He smiled easily, laughed loudly, and knew how everyone took their coffee. If Briar Hollow had a face, it looked a lot like Daniel Mercer. 2 rows behind him sat Lydia Rowe. Lydia didn't belong to Briar Hollow in the same way. She had arrived 12 years earlier, newly married, carrying boxes and secrets from somewhere far enough away that no one asked questions. She worked at the town library, quiet and observant, the kind of woman who remembered details people didn't realize they had shared. She volunteered for holiday events, donated baked goods, and smiled politely at town gossip without ever participating in it. Daniel and Lydia were connected by something no one else could see. The service ended just after 7. Snow had thickened, the sky turning that heavy, silent white that made the world feel smaller. Families stepped outside, breath fogging the air, exchanging holiday wishes and promises to see each other the next morning. Daniel shook hands with the pastor, hugged his mother, and waved to Lydia. Their eyes met for a moment longer than necessary. No one noticed. No one ever did. By 8:30, Briar Hollow had gone quiet again. At exactly 6:42 a.m. on Christmas morning, the town's stillness shattered. The call came into the Briar Hollow Police Department, which was little more than a converted municipal building with 2 patrol cars and 1 full-time officer on duty that day. The dispatcher answered groggily, expecting a noise complaint or a fender bender caused by the snow. Instead, she heard a voice she recognized instantly. It was Daniel Mercer. His tone was controlled, steady, almost too calm for the words he was saying. "There's been an accident," he said. "I need someone to come out to Lydia Rowe's house. I think she's dead." Officer Thomas Hale arrived 9 minutes later. He would later say he knew something was wrong before he even stepped inside. The house sat too quietly. No lights on, no signs of struggle from the outside. Snow untouched except for a single set of footprints leading from the road to the front door. Daniel stood on the porch, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His face was pale, eyes rimmed red, but he didn't shake. He didn't cry. He nodded once when Hale approached, stepping aside without being asked. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon. Christmas decorations were everywhere, tasteful and restrained. A tree stood in the corner of the living room, its lights still glowing softly, as if no one had thought to turn them off. Lydia Rowe lay at the bottom of the stairs. Her body was positioned awkwardly, one arm twisted beneath her, her head turned at an unnatural angle. To an untrained eye, it looked like a fall, a tragic accident, something unfortunate but explainable. Officer Hale knelt beside her, checking for a pulse he already knew wouldn't be there. "She's cold," he said quietly. Daniel nodded again. "I figured." When Hale asked how Daniel found her, the answer came immediately. "I was bringing her a Christmas gift. She didn't answer the door. I let myself in, found her like this." It sounded reasonable, too reasonable. Within an hour, Briar Hollow buzzed with whispers. By noon, everyone knew Lydia Rowe was dead. By dinner, everyone knew how. By nightfall, everyone believed the same story: a tragic accident. Except they didn't, because Briar Hollow had a secret it never spoke aloud. They all knew Daniel Mercer had been having an affair with Lydia Rowe. It wasn't official knowledge, it wasn't written down, but it was understood in the way small towns understand things without proof. Lingering glances, too many late-night visits under the excuse of helping with repairs, the way Lydia stopped attending church as regularly after her marriage fell apart. Everyone knew. And yet, when Officer Hale asked around, no one said a word. Not the neighbors who had seen Daniel's truck parked outside Lydia's house late at night. Not the woman at the post office who once overheard Lydia crying on the phone saying he won't leave her. Not even Daniel's wife, Margaret, who sat stiffly in her kitchen, staring at her untouched coffee as the news spread. The official report listed the cause of death as accidental fall pending autopsy. But in Briar Hollow, accidents didn't feel like this. By the evening of Christmas Day, snow fell harder, erasing footprints, covering roads, sealing the town inside itself. Lydia Rowe's house stood dark and silent, police tape fluttering faintly in the wind like a warning no one wanted to read. Inside the town diner, conversations dropped to whispers whenever Daniel Mercer walked in to pick up food for his family. People avoided his eyes, some patted his shoulder, some looked away. No one accused him. No one defended him. Because in Briar Hollow, the truth was already known. And the most terrifying part was not that a woman had been killed. It was that everyone knew who did it, and no one was willing to say it out loud. The snowstorm that settled over Briar Hollow on the night after Christmas felt deliberate, as if nature itself had decided to protect the town from scrutiny. Roads vanished under thick white drifts. Phone lines crackled. The nearest medical examiner's office, 2 hours away on a clear day, became unreachable by car. Lydia Rowe's body remained where it was found for nearly 16 hours. Officer Thomas Hale hated that part most. He sat in his patrol car outside Lydia's house, engine idling, watching snow pile against the tires. Inside, behind the taped-off door, a woman lay dead while the town slept and celebrated. It felt wrong. It felt careless. But Briar Hollow had always existed slightly outside the rules of the larger world. Things moved slower here. Questions were asked quieter. By the time the county medical examiner finally arrived the next afternoon, nearly everyone in town had already decided what had happened. She fell. It was an accident. Tragic, but no one's fault. The examiner, Dr. Evelyn Marsh, was not from Briar Hollow. She didn't attend the same church. She didn't know anyone's parents. She didn't grow up hearing which families were good and which were trouble. That distance mattered. Dr. Marsh stood at the base of the staircase, hands on her hips, studying Lydia's body before anyone touched it. "Falls don't usually look like this," she said. Officer Hale glanced up sharply. "What do you mean?" She pointed with a gloved finger. The angle of the neck, the bruising on the wrists, and that stair edge, there's no blood there. If she fell from halfway up, there should be impact evidence. No one responded. They transported Lydia's body that evening once the roads cleared just enough. The snowstorm swallowed the procession almost immediately, erasing any visible sign that something terrible had happened there at all. 2 days later, the autopsy report arrived. Cause of death, manual strangulation, followed by a staged fall. Time of death, estimated between 9 and 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve. Officer Hale read the report twice before setting it down. His mouth felt dry. His hands trembled just enough that he clasped them together. It wasn't an accident. It never had been. Chief Raymond Dorsey, who had served as Briar Hollow's police chief for 27 years, read the report in silence. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "We proceed carefully," he said. "This town doesn't need panic." Hale stared at him. "This town needs the truth." Dorsey sighed. The truth has consequences. By the end of the day, word of the autopsy had spread anyway. It always did. Briar Hollow didn't rely on official announcements. It relied on glances and pauses, on the way voices dropped mid-sentence. Lydia Rowe hadn't fallen. She had been killed. And now the unspoken certainty became heavier. Everyone knew who had been with her that night. Daniel Mercer. Daniel was brought in for questioning the following morning. He arrived willingly, coat neatly buttoned, hair combed, eyes tired but focused. He brought his own coffee in a thermos, as if this were just another obligation to be handled politely. Chief Dorsey led the interview. Officer Hale sat in the corner, notebook open, listening. Daniel's story didn't change. He had been home with his wife and children on Christmas Eve. They watched movies, exchanged gifts at midnight, went to bed early because of the storm. He woke early, drove to Lydia's house to drop off a gift as a kind gesture, found her dead. "And the affair?" Dorsey asked quietly. Daniel didn't flinch. There was no affair. Hale felt anger flare in his chest. "Half the town saw you there regularly, late nights, overnight." Daniel met his eyes calmly. "People talk." Dorsey leaned back in his chair. "Your wife confirms you were home all night." Daniel nodded once. "She would." Margaret Mercer sat in the waiting room during the interview, hands folded in her lap. When Hale glanced through the glass, she looked straight ahead, expression fixed, as if staring at something only she could see. The interview ended without an arrest. There was no physical evidence tying Daniel to Lydia's death. The snowstorm had erased footprints. Any fibers or skin under Lydia's nails were inconclusive. No witnesses had come forward. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. And perhaps most damning of all, no one wanted to testify. The town closed ranks in a way Hale had never seen before. People who had once whispered freely now shrugged and claimed uncertainty. Memories blurred, details vanished. "I might be mistaken. I don't want to get involved. It was Christmas. People were emotional." Hale drove home that night furious, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. He passed Lydia's dark house, now stripped of decorations, the tree lights finally gone. It felt obscene how quickly her presence had been erased. At the diner, Daniel Mercer sat with friends, eating soup. Laughter rose and fell around him, forced but present. Someone clapped him on the back. Hale watched from across the street, feeling sick. Because justice didn't fail loudly in Briar Hollow. It failed politely. Dr. Marsh called Hale directly 2 days later. "There's something else. Defensive wounds on Lydia's wrists. She fought back hard." "Did you find DNA?" Hale asked. "Skin cells, but nothing usable. Whoever did this knew what they were doing or got very lucky." Hale hung up the phone and sat in silence. Daniel Mercer had coached children, fixed furnaces, shared beers at town barbecues. He had been trusted implicitly, and now that trust had become his shield. The case stalled. Weeks passed. Christmas decorations came down. Life resumed its slow rhythm. Lydia Rowe's name was spoken less and less, until it became uncomfortable to mention at all. But Officer Hale couldn't let it go. Late one night, reviewing notes, he noticed something small: Daniel's timeline. Daniel claimed he arrived at Lydia's house just after dawn on Christmas morning, but a snowplow log passed Main Street at 5:38 a.m. Too early. When Hale brought it to Chief Dorsey, the older man stared at the paper for a long time. "Be careful," Dorsey said quietly. "This town won't forgive you for tearing it apart." Hale replied, "It already tore itself apart when it chose silence." Outside, snow began to fall again, and in Briar Hollow, everyone knew the killer was still walking free. Not because there was no truth, but because no one wanted to be the one to finally speak it. The weeks after Christmas in Briar Hollow were heavy with unspoken tension. Daniel Mercer continued his routine as if nothing had happened, coaching children at Little League, stocking shelves at the hardware store, attending church on Sundays. But every step was watched, every interaction silently weighed by the townspeople who all knew his secret. Detective Thomas Hale returned to Lydia Rowe's house multiple times, each visit more disheartening than the last. The forensic evidence had been painstakingly collected, but the snowstorm had erased any immediate clues outside. Inside, the crime scene had been meticulously staged. The position of Lydia's body suggested an accidental fall, and no fingerprints beyond her own had been conclusively found on the staircase railing. Whoever had killed her had clearly anticipated the investigation. Hale's frustration grew as he reviewed the autopsy photos again. The defensive wounds on Lydia's wrists were subtle but unmistakable. She had fought. Someone she trusted, someone she knew intimately, had overpowered her in her own home. The juxtaposition of violence and normalcy gnawed at Hale. How could someone so familiar commit such a crime in a town that prided itself on knowing everyone? Meanwhile, Briar Hollow's residents remained silent. Whispers were carried in corners but never voiced directly to the police. The local barber shop, usually the center of gossip, held only polite, tense conversation. Even Margaret Mercer, Daniel's wife, refused to answer direct questions about her husband's whereabouts during the night of the murder. Hale's breakthrough came unexpectedly. He revisited phone records from Christmas Eve and early Christmas morning. The logs revealed multiple pings from Daniel's cell near Lydia's residence hours before he claimed to have arrived with a gift. That timeline contradicted his statement. When Hale brought the discrepancy to Chief Dorsey, the older officer leaned back in his chair, eyes shadowed. "You're digging too deep," Dorsey warned. "This town doesn't need the scandal. People are fragile, and some secrets are better left alone." Hale ignored him. He interviewed neighbors again, this time more discreetly. One elderly woman, Mrs. Calloway, mentioned she had seen Daniel's truck parked outside Lydia's house late Christmas Eve, earlier than he admitted. Another neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, recalled hearing voices from inside the house around the same time. Their testimonies, while fragmented, began to form a timeline that contradicted Daniel's official statement. Hale also began to analyze the psychological aspect. Daniel Mercer was widely regarded as polite, charming, and trustworthy, the very qualities that made him dangerous. Those who trusted him implicitly were the ones who could be manipulated most easily. The town's collective silence became a tool he could hide behind. No one could accuse him openly because to do so would require breaking an unspoken social contract, a contract Hale found infuriatingly obstructive to justice. Evidence began to converge when Hale examined Lydia's personal records. Notes and journals recovered from her apartment revealed fear and uncertainty. She wrote of being followed, of feeling watched, of someone manipulating her trust. Though she did not explicitly name Daniel, the context was clear. Every sentence carried dread and anticipation. When Hale presented these findings to the county prosecutor, she agreed there was enough to begin building a case. However, she cautioned, small towns like this, people protect their own, whether or not they are right. Witnesses may refuse to testify, and evidence will be minimal outside circumstantial and behavioral. Undeterred, Hale pressed forward. He confronted Daniel a second time with the new timeline evidence. "Daniel," he said, sliding the log across the table, "your cell phone shows activity near Lydia's house hours before you say you arrived. How do you explain this?" Daniel leaned back, hands clasped. He remained calm, almost unnervingly so. "I don't know what you're talking about. I drove past. I wasn't there." Hale's jaw tightened. "You were there. We know the snowstorm didn't start later. People saw your truck. You lied." Daniel's eyes flickered briefly, just a micro expression, but long enough for Hale to note. I wanted to give her a gift, that's all. I didn't know." "You didn't know?" Hale pressed. "You were seen entering her house. You knew something happened, didn't you?" Daniel remained silent. Hale realized that the first cracks in Daniel's carefully constructed story were beginning to show. He had relied on trust and routine to shield him from suspicion, but circumstantial evidence, combined with the town's subtle collective awareness, was now eroding the illusion. By late afternoon, Hale reviewed surveillance from a neighbor who had security cameras outside their home. The footage showed Daniel leaving his residence late on Christmas Eve, truck loaded, and heading towards Lydia Street. Though it was not definitive proof of murder, it contradicted Daniel's timeline and strengthened the pattern of behavior suggesting opportunity and premeditation. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer began to feel the pressure. Within Briar Hollow, subtle shifts emerged. Friends no longer greeted him warmly. Shopkeepers were cold and distant. Children averted their eyes. The town's silent judgment had begun to manifest, an invisible but tangible weight pressing against him. Hale knew the investigation had reached a turning point. It was no longer about gathering evidence. It was about outmaneuvering the protective shell of the town. To bring justice for Lydia Rowe, he would have to break through decades of loyalty, fear, and unspoken rules. The snowstorm had masked the crime. The town's knowledge had protected the killer. But Hale now held the beginnings of a timeline, physical evidence, and psychological insight that could not be ignored. By nightfall, Hale stared out over Briar Hollow. Lights twinkled in the homes, peaceful, oblivious. He felt the weight of inevitability. In a town where everyone knew the killer, justice depended on the one person willing to speak the truth despite the consequences. And Hale was ready to be that person. By mid-January, Briar Hollow had returned to a fragile semblance of normalcy. Snow melted into muddy streets, Christmas lights had been packed away, and residents busied themselves with work and school. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Everyone knew what had happened on Christmas Eve, and everyone knew who was responsible, but no one had yet spoken openly. Detective Thomas Hale felt the pressure mounting. He had gathered circumstantial evidence, phone logs, neighbor observations, and psychological indicators pointing to Daniel Mercer, but without a definitive witness or physical proof, prosecution seemed distant. Every day, the town's silent complicity worked against him, yet Hale refused to let the case die in polite secrecy. It was Daniel himself who provided the first real cracks in his carefully constructed alibi. Hale obtained surveillance footage from a gas station on the outskirts of town. The timestamp showed Daniel's truck refueling at 10:15 p.m. on Christmas Eve, nearly 2 hours before he claimed to be home with his family. The footage also showed him alone, the truck lights illuminating a determined expression on his face. When confronted, Daniel maintained composure, but the lie was undeniable. "I went out for gas," he repeated. "I wanted to make sure we had enough for the snowstorm. That's all." Hale noted the slight twitch in Daniel's jaw, a fleeting expression revealing the tension beneath his calm. Next, Hale turned to financial records. Lydia had recently withdrawn a sum of money from her bank account, and Daniel had been listed as a co-signer on a few shared purchases. While the amounts were modest, the timing suggested a potential motive linked to money and control, subtle enough to be hidden beneath the surface of their daily lives. Hale also re-interviewed Margaret Mercer. At first, she clung to the narrative that Daniel had been home all night, confident in her husband's alibi, but subtle contradictions emerged. She could not account for Daniel's whereabouts between 10 p.m. and midnight. Her statements shifted slightly each time she recounted them, hinting at either confusion or a subconscious awareness of complicity. The town began to sense a shift. Gossip, once muffled, grew louder. Small, nervous glances were exchanged at the diner and post office. People who had previously avoided eye contact with Daniel now whispered warnings to each other. For the first time, the social shield protecting him was weakening. Hale's team then focused on the physical environment of the crime scene. A meticulous review revealed fingerprints on a decorative vase at the top of the stairs. Daniel's prints, partially smudged but unmistakable. This suggested he had been at the top of the staircase, placing him at the scene during the critical window of Lydia's death. Combined with the defensive wounds on Lydia's wrists, the evidence increasingly contradicted his claims of accidental involvement. Neighbors provided additional insight. One man, Mr. Jenkins, admitted he had seen Daniel's truck parked near Lydia's home later than Daniel had claimed. Another, Mrs. Calloway, remembered hearing the faint sound of raised voices around 11 p.m., though she had dismissed it at the time as a domestic dispute. Both had been reluctant to come forward before, fearful of social ostracization in a town that prized discretion. Hale began to piece together the sequence of events. Daniel left home under the guise of routine, visited Lydia's house with a premeditated purpose, and left her dead in a way that appeared accidental. The careful placement of her body on the stairs, combined with subtle manipulation of the environment, lighting, decorations, and the snowstorm, demonstrated planning and control rather than spontaneous violence. Daniel's demeanor began to falter during questioning. He hesitated when asked to recount his movements, repeated himself unnecessarily, and occasionally avoided eye contact. These micro-behaviors, combined with the mounting forensic and circumstantial evidence, suggested he understood the walls around him were crumbling. The town's silence, once his shield, now became a source of subtle pressure. Friends who once smiled politely now offered cold greetings. Colleagues exchanged meaningful glances. Even children who had idolized him at Little League practices began to keep their distance. In a town that had once protected him by choice, the social environment was shifting to isolation. Finally, Hale obtained Lydia's personal journal. Within its pages were passages describing her growing fear of Daniel, her unease with the late-night visits, and a suspicion that he might act unpredictably if pushed too far. While the journal did not directly accuse Daniel, it painted a chilling portrait of premeditated psychological manipulation and fear, the emotional backdrop of the crime. Hale realized that the combination of digital evidence, eyewitness accounts, forensic analysis, and behavioral patterns created a compelling case. Daniel's alibi was no longer believable. Every layer he had constructed was peeling away under scrutiny. By the end of Scene 4, the investigation had reached a decisive turning point. The killer's public facade of respectability was faltering. The carefully orchestrated accident, designed to exploit Briar Hollow's culture of silence, now was exposed to the relentless scrutiny of law enforcement. The snow that had once masked the crime was melting, revealing footprints, timelines, and inconsistencies. And Daniel Mercer, the man everyone had trusted, was facing a truth he could no longer avoid. In a town where everyone knew the killer, justice could finally catch up. By late February, Briar Hollow had grown restless. The snow had mostly melted, leaving muddy roads and the faint smell of damp earth. Life in town carried on, but the shadow of Lydia Rowe's death lingered over every street, every shop, and every home. The silent knowledge that Daniel Mercer had killed her had begun to weigh heavily on the community. People no longer whispered politely. They avoided, stared, and questioned. The town's collective conscience was fraying. Detective Thomas Hale had finally built a case strong enough to move forward. The combination of surveillance footage, phone records, fingerprints, the autopsy report, and Lydia's journal created a timeline that left no room for Daniel's denials. Every carefully crafted element of his alibi had been dismantled. Daniel was brought in for a formal arrest. He walked into the police station with the same composed demeanor he had displayed since Christmas, but there was a subtle tension in his posture. For the first time, he could sense the walls closing in. "Daniel Mercer," Hale said, his voice low but steady, "you are under arrest for the murder of Lydia Rowe." Daniel's eyes flickered, just briefly, but enough to betray the control he had maintained for weeks. He nodded once, silently, as though acknowledging the inevitability of what was coming. During questioning, Daniel continued to claim innocence, insisting that he had merely visited Lydia with a gift and found her already deceased. Hale presented the evidence in a calm, precise manner: timestamps, fingerprints, journal entries, and the physical evidence from the staircase. The contradictions were too glaring to dismiss. Slowly, under relentless scrutiny, cracks began to appear. His words became less measured, sentences repeated, defenses faltered. The facade of innocence was crumbling. Meanwhile, Briar Hollow could no longer maintain its collective silence. Neighbors, once hesitant, began to share what they knew with law enforcement: sightings of Daniel's truck, unusual noises late on Christmas Eve, and subtle clues that had been dismissed at the time. The community's accumulated observations provided a crucial supplement to the formal investigation, strengthening the case and revealing the full scope of Daniel's actions. The trial, held in the nearby county courthouse, was tense. Every seat was filled, and many townspeople traveled just to witness the proceedings. Hale testified, presenting a detailed reconstruction of the timeline, the forensic findings, and the behavioral evidence that had pointed directly to Daniel Mercer. Daniel's defense attempted to frame the crime as an accident born from panic, stress, and human error. They emphasized his previously good reputation, his role as a father and community member, and his lack of a direct motive for murder. But the prosecution countered with precision. They outlined the premeditation, the deliberate manipulation of timing, the staging of Lydia's fall, the methodical use of the snowstorm to mask activity, and the careful control of the domestic environment. The defensive wounds, the journal evidence, and the inconsistencies in Daniel's statements. Witnesses who had once remained silent stepped forward under subpoena. Neighbors recounted the events of Christmas Eve and Christmas morning with unwavering consistency. The town's tacit knowledge, once a shield for the killer, became testimony that exposed the truth. When the verdict was delivered, the courtroom was silent. Daniel Mercer was found guilty of first-degree murder. He had killed someone who trusted him, exploited the familiarity of a small town, and attempted to manipulate a holiday to disguise his crime. As he was escorted from the courtroom, his composure remained outwardly intact, but Hale noticed a subtle tremor in his hands. Justice arrived, even if late. The town of Briar Hollow slowly began to recover. Christmases to come would carry a shadow of the past, a memory of the day trust was broken and innocence destroyed. Families spoke more cautiously, neighbors observed one another more closely. The memory of Lydia Rowe remained, a silent reminder of the consequences of secrecy and deception. For Hale, the case reinforced the delicate balance between law and community. In small towns, silence can shield the guilty as easily as it protects the innocent. But with patience, observation, and persistence, truth can pierce even the thickest layer of trust. By the end, Briar Hollow had spoken, not in loud accusations or public outrage, but through the steady work of law enforcement, the courage of those who finally testified, and the undeniable evidence that had laid bare a murderer in their midst. Lydia Rowe's story and the darkness that had visited the town that Christmas would not be forgotten. In Briar Hollow, the quietest season of the year had revealed the darkest side of human nature, and everyone, victim, town, and detective alike, would carry the lessons forward.